everyone, welcome to our session. My name is Andrew Townsend. I'm with eLearning Brothers. Today's webinar is going to be about storyboarding for eLearning. Should be very educational. This session will be recorded and we'll get a copy of it sent out to everybody who is in attendance, and we'll also get it to everybody who is registered but wasn't able to attend today. If you have questions during the webinar or comments, or you'd like to participate one way or another, please do use the questions panel that is part of your GoToWebinar control panel. It looks like several of you have already found that. Hello. All right, so to talk to us about storyboarding, we have Monica Newell, one of our amazing instructional designers, with us. Thanks for joining us. Thanks for taking the time from your busy schedule to present this webinar. And without further ado, I'll go ahead and turn the time over to you, Monica.
All right, well, thank you very much for having me. I'm really excited to be here today. I'm going to be offering some tips for starting the storyboarding process, maybe for those of you who have never storyboarded before, or maybe you're just starting with it and aren't really sure about best practices. And then I'm also going to be offering some tricks that I've learned along the way about how to make the process more efficient. So I think we should probably start with a poll. For those of you who have experience with storyboarding, tell us how you start a new project. Do you jump right in? You follow the order of the client's content and start designing slide by slide? Do you develop some kind of a plan? Maybe some general planning, maybe you provide an overview, or you use a high-level outline, something that you can reference. Or maybe do you do something a little bit more detailed and create a blueprint? So offering more specific details about what you're going to have content-wise and visually on your slide. For those of you who
that poll is up on the screen right now. It looks like a good chunk of the audience has voted. There's a definite winner here, Monica. I'll give you guys about 5 more seconds to vote. Just click right on the screen to let us know how you start your storyboarding process. And okay, so here's those results. So 65% of the audience develops a basic plan first. 21% create a full blueprint, and 14% just jump right in. So there's a definite winner there with B, but there's people that do A and C.
Okay, and I will definitely say that I kind of do a combination of B and C. I find that sometimes if it's going to be helpful and I really have a very clear idea, then I'm going to want to create as detailed a blueprint as I can, because as much planning as I can do up front is going to make it so much easier down the road. But there are a lot of times where perhaps the content doesn't lend itself to that kind of planning, or I still have some things I haven't figured out, and so I'm going to go with more of a high-level plan. But regardless, I cannot impress enough upon how important it is to do some kind of planning. So it sounds like you're all kind of there for the most part. So let's talk a little bit more about why planning is so important. I think as instructional designers, when we feel the crunch of that deadline, it's our tendency to just want to dive in, try to get as many slides out of the way as possible because you've got so much to do. But it ends up costing you time later is what I found. And you might end up leaving out an objective, or you spend a long time on an activity that doesn't meet one of the objectives and you don't realize it until you finish that activity, and then go, oh man, that was kind of a waste of time. Even though the activity turned out great, it didn't do what it needed to do content-wise and objectively. Or you might end up with a disjointed course because you're looking at slide by slide instead of how they all flow together. Planning is going to help alleviate that. Essentially, it's going to provide you with a logical progression of content to make sure that you are moving in a direction that makes sense for the course and for the learner. And I would definitely liken this to one of my favorite analogies that actually a coworker provided, and she compared it to building a house. And she said that you might jump in, you got this idea of what you want your house to look like, and so you start designing room by room, and you're making these decisions about, your living room is going to look this way, and you're moving from room to room, and they're working out great. and then you realize that you have run out of space for your kitchen, or you've gone over budget, or you aren't going to be able to complete the project in time. And so I find that storyboarding is very similar to that, in that if you don't have a plan, you can find that you've actually run out of time, you've run out of content, or haven't done what you needed to do in the space that you had allotted. So having a plan provides that logical progression. It also makes sure that you've addressed all your learning objectives. And so you know from the outset that your content is specifically tied to those objectives. And as you're spending time on your activities, that they are closely aligned. And then finally, it gives you a realistic idea of seat time. So again, when we get to these activities and we're thinking about, what do I want this level of engagement to be, and how much time do I really have to present this content, you are going to need to keep in mind that we've got this seat time allotment, and we want to make sure that we're adhering to that for our clients and for our learners, so that we're not going over that seat time. So having a plan kind of heads off all of those potential issues, and then we'll make the actual designing the storyboarding process easier. So I actually use a template. Planning is really personal, and I understand it is about organizing the material in a way that makes sense. And I'm not here to tell you that blueprinting is the only way to go. It's just something that's worked really well for me. So I'm offering it as a suggestion. There is definitely an incredible sense of confidence sitting down and having a very robust plan, because it takes a lot of the pressure off to make all of those decisions right then, because you already have a good deal of it planned out. So it frees you up to focus on the visual design instead of kind of trying to do everything at once. So this is the template that I use, and I'm going to talk about it in terms of each section shortly, but I just wanted you to see kind of this is where I start. I pull it up on one screen, pull up my content on another. This is something that I believe we're going to be providing, if that will help you along your way when you are planning. And so then this is what it looks like if you're completely filling it out. This is an example that I've completed, and most of the content that I'm working with is going to come to me either in the form of a PowerPoint deck or in a Word doc. And sometimes the content is in the order that I'm going to work from. Most of the time it's not. So I need a way to instill order. So I usually start by focusing on the goals. Those are where I'm going to place my learning objective or my learning goal. That's going to be the backboard of my storyboard. It's where I'm going to focus on what do I need to accomplish, and then I'm going to work from there. So that way I'm not wasting time focusing on things that aren't working toward the objectives. And so that's where I start.
So on that same vein, though, wouldn't having this sort of a template hinder your creativity? It seems like it's really restricting and really specific.
It's been beneficial for me because it's where I work through ideas. So it's where I'll start to put in content and start to get an idea of what makes sense for reaching an objective. However, I don't always fill out all components of this. So if I feel like I'm not really sure, or if it's a little too specific for me, or it's kind of boxing me into a particular design style, then I won't use that element of it.
All right, great, thanks.
Thank you. So I'm just going to start with the objective. Then I'm going to be adding a page title. For each storyboard slide, you're going to need, or it's helpful to have a specific title just to keep things organized. So if you can come up with it, putting it in here is very helpful. And usually you want to tie it to whatever the focus of that slide is going to be. For The original content, there's a section for content linkage up at the top there, and that's really helpful to me when I'm going through my client content, especially if I've got multiple pages that I'm going to focus on or I'm going to condense in this particular slide or this interaction. I can link that there, so when I go back to do my actual storyboarding, then I know where to find it. So again, it's all about imposing order. And that might not be for everybody. It helps me because I need a certain amount of order, and I found that it makes the storyboarding process a lot easier. Next would be gauging seat time. So having an idea of about how long the presentation of the information is going to take or the interaction might take is really helpful in the planning process because, again, you have to adhere to that seat time. And so you might work through this plan and realize that you actually are going over your seat time and have to make adjustments. This happened to me just a couple weeks ago. I was going through and I'm writing my narration and I'm imagining the character interactions and the conversations and how they're going to link to the activities. And I realized I was entirely over the seat time and there was no way to combine the amount of content that had to go into the course with the character interaction. So I actually ended up having to remove the character guide completely, and all the interactions I had to rewrite so that they didn't involve that character. And since I was just in the planning stage, that probably took about an hour to an hour and a half. But if I had storyboarded it out, I definitely would have been devastated. We would have been talking about hours to make that adjustment, but I could catch it here, which was really helpful. For the approach, that's where we're going to be deciding kind of what is going on in this slide. It also helps me so that I don't get stuck in a rut and say, well, we're going to be doing an animated text slide. It's going to kind of help me diversify.
A quick question has come up about the goals, which seems like a really important section of this storyboarding template. Who identifies those goals? Is that coming from the subject matter expert, you, what stakeholders are determining that? And how does the goals fall into that? Is that just the goal of this slide or is that the goal of the course?
So the goals are going to be represented by the learning objectives, and depending on your content, usually it's going to be provided by your client or by your subject matter expert. They have identified this is what we want our learner to be able to do or to know. And so usually that's going to span a couple of slides because you're going to need to introduce that material. You're going to want to have your learner interact with that material, and then you're going to be checking their comprehension. So that is, it usually is more than one slide, but it is usually identified by the client as what they're trying to accomplish, and you want to make sure that you're meeting that.
All right, great, thank you.
So for the approach, that gives me an idea of kind of what I'm trying to accomplish on this slide in terms of, is this going to be presentational or is it going to be a particular type of interaction? And that'll tie into kind of what I'm thinking visually. But ultimately, you're asking yourself, what is happening on this slide? And what are we trying to accomplish, or how's it being presented? For the visual, this is really nice. If you have an idea of how you're going to lay out the slide, what it might look like, go ahead and include that. Even if it's a rough image, even if it's extremely basic or it's some kind of a sketch or just some shapes to show a layout, it's really helpful if you have an idea as you first go through the information to try to go ahead and jot that down so that when you go back to it, you know what you were thinking at this time. I'm not gonna lie, graphic design is definitely my weakest point and it takes me the most time. So I often, if I have an image or if I have an idea, I'll include it. A lot of times I just describe what I imagine having on this slide. I'll usually write it out or describe what I'm thinking. So that way when I go back to the storyboarding process, I remember, oh, this is how I wanted to present this. But I'm not gonna spend a lot of time including the visual. Now, maybe the visual part is one of your strongest areas and you want to do a mock-up. by all means. I just know that it takes me longer, and because I don't want to waste any time at all, I want to use this to the best of what works for me. And coming up with the images isn't always super efficient for me. All right, and then at the bottom, you'll notice the to be resolved section, which is wonderful as you're working through content, and that's where you come up with your questions where you realize, hey, I don't really know enough about this to be able to present it well, or I'm not sure how this question should be framed, or I'm not sure where this information is, or where this chart that is mentioned is located. You can include those there, and that's a really helpful way to kind of organize all the material that you need to follow up on or you need to ask a subject matter expert about. So that brings us to presentation and ultimately the narration. If it's possible, it's really helpful to include your on-screen text here. If you have a small amount of text or you know kind of what you're going to be saying on the slide, go ahead and throw it in there. Obviously, it's in the planning stage. You don't need to have all that information. But I will admit that it's definitely very helpful to me to try to write out all of my narration. So I will, if I can, I will try to write out everything that's going to be narrated for that section. So I will include my narration. So on that vein, since our goal as instructional designers is ultimately to create an experience for our learners, using narration to create engaging scenarios is extremely effective. Ultimately, when it comes down to it, I care about the story. And when I'm in the learner's chair, I'm going to be asking, why should I care? Using narration to generate either a relatable character with a plausible story or provide context is going to create a more meaningful experience for your learner, and it's going to add weight to whatever information you're providing. So I will, when I'm creating a scenario, I will write out all of my narration first, and then I will break it into snippets so that I have what's going to be on each slide. So if I'm creating a scene where I've got two characters talking and they're going back and forth, in order for me to storyboard this, I would need to break it up into the individual scenes. And so my developer knows what their pose looks like when they say a particular line. So I'll go ahead and write all the dialogue first, and then I'll go through and set up the slides with their poses and break up the dialogue to match. So that helps me create a fluid interaction instead of doing one scene, writing the dialogue, going to the next slide and writing the dialogue. Again, it's about creating that fluid interaction. And so we do that with planning, and then also kind of having the larger idea of what is happening, what is the experience, and then how do we break that down to create it. And so narration is going to do that for us. Then I can use that narration to tie into whatever the learning activity is that I want to present. And I can simulate on a small scale what the learner might have to do in that character situation. So here, our struggling director wants to ask his colleagues for advice. And I can have them weigh in on what he should do. And it gives me a really great opportunity to present content that the learner needs to know without just throwing it up as a bullet point list. Instead, I can either have them ask a colleague, or I could have them ask an expert, and I can present this information that they need to meet the learning objective in a way that provides a little bit more context and seems like a little bit more of an experience. So I found that if the learner feels a sense of investment, it creates another reason beyond intrinsic motivation for the learner to want to get the answer right. And so we do that by including that narration and then building that scenario, and then suddenly you have something that means a little bit more than just a multiple choice question, because now you've got a character who has a problem and needs to find a solution. And you've got other people, the experts or the colleagues who have gotten involved. And so now there just feels like there's a little bit more weight, which I found really helpful. So this seems like a perfect opportunity to talk about selecting activities. So let's do another poll. What is your method for selecting activities for your learner? Do you primarily go with whatever comes to mind? I mean, follow my instincts, use whatever comes to mind. Time's of the essence. Got to go with what you feel first. Base it on the content. I look at how much content I need to convey and decide on the best method of delivery. Or do you focus on creating an experience? I consider the learning objective and what kind of experience would best help the learner meet that objective. For those of you who use a different method or a combination of these, feel free to comment in the questions panel.
So again, you can click right on the screen. This is up there. And once again, Monica, there's the definite winner here. A lot of people are agreeing on one of these. We'll give you guys about 5 more seconds to vote. Maybe you can change the swing of things here. All right, and here's those results. So 56% of our audience base it on the content, 35% create an experience, and 9% go with whatever comes to mind. So there's a definite winner there with base it on the content.
All right, once again, I'm going to be definitely on the same page with you. I am definitely more of a combination of B and C. I want to create an experience. But ultimately, sometimes the content doesn't lend the experience that I'm trying to create. And so I have to wrap it around that to figure out the best way to present it. So it comes down to that issue of balance, of balancing creativity with realistic ability and content. What do I have to work with? So thinking about selecting interactions, options are great until they become completely overwhelming. You've got sliders, dials, clicked reveals, drag and drops, and they can all be customized to generate hundreds of possible interaction options. And you want the perfect one for your course. So it's really nice to have all of these choices, but I have definitely spent more time than I really want to admit trying to select the best interaction for an activity. So I've learned to try to find a balance between creating an experience with the best treatment of content. And so that's kind of what drives how I select interactions. So I'm going to give you a few interactions that I use on a regular basis, kind of why they work and how I alter them to fit my needs. So drag and drops. When you are creating a familiar space for your learner, it makes a difference. We, again, are trying to create that experience. And so if we're thinking about a drag and drop, there isn't physically much difference between sorting square shapes and sorting Post-its. But if we can provide a visual connection, it helps make the activity seem more worthwhile. You put them in an environment that seems familiar. You're having them do something that they might actually do. My desk is regularly littered with Post-its, and I am constantly having to sort them into the ones that I'm going to throw away and the ones that have to stay there to remind me of things so I don't forget. So the idea that this is something that they might physically do, and yet we're basically having them categorize information. So here's a knowledge check where the learner had to decide which program details were local decisions and which one required federal approval. So they could sort them onto the notepad if it was something that they could do locally, or they could put it on the laptop if it was something that they had to complete an application for, or it was a federal decision. So again, just sorting information, but we're kind of changing the nature of how it looks. Sometimes the amount of content doesn't lend itself to that, and you need something that's a little bit more straightforward because of the nature of the details or just how much you have. So for the sake of seat time, you've got to make decisions about what is going to still accomplish your learning objective and yet still provide a little bit of interaction. So here you have an example where we didn't make a lot of sense in terms of seat time to have learners sorting 20 things. So instead we grouped them, and then they're still identifying what the benefits were connected to. But in this case, we've grouped those, and then there's just dragging and dropping the labels that go along with them. So ultimately, I think it comes down to balancing experience and presentation, especially as a beginner, because that can just be so overwhelming. And that's what I found. So let me just take a minute to convey how much I love marker activities. If I had to choose my favorite, hands down, this would be it. They're easy to build. Most of them will take a single image and you're just placing markers on them, which if you're working in PowerPoint is just an icon. If you're working in Storyline, you can actually add the marker and the box that you're going to type into pops up as well. So it is not time consuming to find your image because it's just going to be one. It is an effective way to convey lots of information because you can put markers all over this image, and it's still providing an experience. Here you're teaching a learner how to read a statement from the HOA invoice statement. So it was a very real experience. People read statements every day and need to identify what the information is and where to find particular information on this document. And so we could use markers to accomplish that. Extremely effective in terms of, hey, this is something that you're going to do, it's relevant to you, but at the same time, it's not taking a lot of build time for me in terms of generating the idea. It's very, very low key. So it's getting a lot done, conveying a lot of information. That balance between creativity and creating experience and managing content, marker activities are where it's at, I'm not gonna lie. However, again, going back to narration and creating that experience, a scenario is going to be definitely more involved to build out, but it's going to be really effective and let you do a lot of things that is going to be particularly engaging for your learner. So scenarios are really helpful for providing context, and we've got a couple different types. A basic scenario like this one is nice because you can include it without having to give a whole lot of backstory. This character doesn't even need to have any dialogue. She can simply have just a bit of text on the screen, and then we can narrate her backstory. So maybe after you've presented some content, then you can introduce her by saying, okay, so Lisa's trying to find funding guidelines for replacing weather stripping in low-income homes. Where should she look? She doesn't need to talk. She doesn't need to have a whole story, but now you've got some context for how you can help her find this information. So it's still basically just a multiple choice question, but it's setting it up with context and a protagonist. So you're adding weight to it. And it's something that, in this case, the learner might have to look for and needs to know where to look. So now we've given them a scenario they might find themselves in, and it means more. But it wasn't that involved to present something that basically is a multiple choice question. And so by doing so, ultimately, you're creating opportunity for investment, and that is what we're trying to do. So we have a basic scenario that doesn't involve so much storytelling. And then you have a more immersive scenario. So if you've got the time and the budget for a more involved interaction, you can spend some time expanding that scenario and be a little bit more creative. You can set the stage, you can introduce your characters. So for this example, say you're out to dinner with your daughter, you're celebrating the fact that she's gotten all A's on her report card, and you let her choose the restaurant. So she picks this hip local gastropub because she's feeling very grown up, and you are ready to have an experience. So your server comes over, he's polite, but he's busy. And so he speeds through the specials, doesn't acknowledge your daughter, tells you that the kitchen is busy, so you should probably order quickly, and then hurries away to get your drinks. So at this point, your daughter looks kind of upset. She hasn't been acknowledged and she looks a little deflated, and you're thoroughly annoyed. You came to have an experience. So you ask for a different server. And now you've got another server who comes up, and we can present that character walking over and that dialogue, and she is immediately much more in tune. She acknowledges your daughter. She asks if it's a special occasion. She recommends some favorite dishes. And so you've kind of set the stage for these two different experiences. And by doing so, you can then make the learner make a judgment call and identify best and worst practices based on the experience that they just had in that scenario. So it's an excellent opportunity to kind of build out that experience instead of just saying, hey, here's what one server said in text, and here's what another server said in text, and what do you think? If you have the time and the opportunity to make that more immersive, then you're going to have such a more significant impact on the learner retaining that, the learner being engaged, and I think making it more, making it have more weight for the learner to feel that it's important, that this might be something that is relevant and that I can use, so it's worth my time. So there are going to be plenty of instances where a straightforward matching activity or card sort or click to reveal are going to get the job done. And we definitely shouldn't ignore those solid activities just because they're basic. Especially as beginners, you want to use what makes the most sense and is a balance of creativity and effectiveness. However, as instructional designers, we're striving for a creative experience. And I think ultimately we should strive for it because our learners deserve it. The last thing that we want is to give them something very mundane. And so if we can create that experience just by going a little bit further with the scenario, then in many instances, if you have the opportunity, do that. So that's why I'm a big fan of scenarios, but I do understand that they take time. So I think for the last portion of today's webinar, I would like to address a few of the things that tend to bog down instructional designers. So I'd like to know what you feel slows you down the most when you're storyboarding. Is it generating new ways to present content? I mean, let's face it, you can only animate text so many ways. So coming up with a creative way can be a struggle. Is it creating a cohesive feel? So you want to change the layout so every slide doesn't look the same, but then it feels like maybe they're not part of the same course. Or just the details, alignment, shape style, image size, fonts, spacing. It just takes so much time to arrange those things. So I'd like to know what you feel slows you down the most. And if it's a combination of these or something else entirely, feel free to comment in the questions panel.
So again, you can click right on the screen to let us know what's slowing you down. Looks like a good portion of you. There's not so much a clear winner for this one, Monica.
Okay.
Looks like there's a mix of things that are slowing people down. We'll go ahead and close this out and show the results. 46% get lost in the details, and 44% are having a hard time generating new ways to present content, and 9% are creating a cohesive feel. So there's a good mix between getting lost in the details and generating new ways to present content. And along these same lines, another question came up about how do you limit yourself to a certain number of activities per course? If there's so many great activities that you can make in a course, how do you limit those?
Sure. I think it's ultimately you want to see that interaction as the best way to either get information across or to check comprehension. And so I try to find a balance. It's usually somewhere, it depends on the interaction. That's a tough question. So it depends on the nature of, if I'm trying to get content across, then I'm going to want to have a balance of half interaction and half presentational. But it also depends on the level of the course. So if you've got a client who just wants a straightforward, I need to present this information, I need to make sure they know it, that's it kind of course, then it's going to be a lot more of those, okay, let's just interact with this content so that learners are seeing it, they're getting a sense of what it is. If the client wants to build an experience or behavior that they want their learners to replicate, then that's when I'm going to know, okay, not only do I need to present the information, but I also need to make sure that I'm building those opportunities where they're experiencing scenarios so that they're having that kind of interaction or they're seeing that context. So
Sure.
it totally depends.
Great. There's also one other question that came up. Well, not a question, it's a statement that we've heard a couple times. What slows me down the most is motivating myself to use the software that we're forced to use. Someone does not like their tool.
I can understand that sentiment for sure, especially when you feel like there's you found a more efficient way and suddenly that's not an option anymore. Yes. So, well, I find that I am across the board. I've run into all of these as an instructional designer, especially getting started. They have all presented themselves as a struggle at some point or another. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how I've addressed kind of all of them. And so I would start by saying that, we're going back to this idea of balancing creativity and deadlines. And that's where you've got that bog that sets in. And when I began as an instructional designer, I struggled with the pressure of completing projects on time just because everything seemed to take so long. And there would be times where I just look at a set of slides and I just draw a complete blank because I couldn't come up with a revolutionary way to display another bullet point list or a paragraph of information. And it was just that sense of I am so stuck. Some things that can help that I have found. First of all, I would say that templates have been incredibly helpful. For many of you, a template is an easy solution to a lot of these time-eating issues. They are going to provide presentation and interaction slides. So they give you this really solid foundation. And I mean, you can purchase these or you could, we'll talk about brainstorming in just a minute, but for many of them, you can purchase them and they will give you the presentation and interaction slides, offer a consistent theme with varying layouts, so you don't have to worry about those details. They'll have preset images, shapes, text sizes, alignments, so you don't have to spend time worrying about those things. But they're also great sources of inspiration. Since I work for a custom shop, and we do everything from the ground up, I definitely understand the challenge of trying to design an interaction or a layout without a toolbox of go-to interactions or presentational ideas. I have to admit, early on, I had to create a course that called for 4 instances of animated motion graphics. And at that point, I had created exactly 0 animated motion graphics and had no idea how to approach that. I had no idea how to lay it out. I had no idea how to storyboard it. I mean, I was stuck. Thankfully, I have amazing coworkers, and one suggested that I look at some of the templates in the ELB library. So eLearning Brothers has a great template library that I'll talk about in just a minute. But she suggested that I go there to check out the templates just to get ideas of how to move forward. And so by doing that, I was able to kind of imagine how I would piece together narration and the iconography that I wanted to use in a way that was more exciting than just, again, throwing it up on the screen or having it animated from the side, but something a little bit more interactive than that. So I find in terms of inspiration, templates are my go-to when I'm really stuck. So I feel like I have to mention eLearning Brothers template library here, not only because it's a great resource to buy templates, but it's also a great place to get ideas. Again, those questions that you're struggling with in terms of how am I going to present this layout, or what do I want to do in terms of interactions, or how do I create that cohesive feel, they're going to take care of that for you, and that's really helpful. Also, the saving grace from my animated motion graphic issue is the After Effects template library that is also provided by eLearning Brothers. This is what my coworker recommended, and I check them out on a regular basis when I'm doing anything that's going to be animated that I want to be a little bit more exciting than a basic animation. And so I find that one of my biggest struggles, which results in a lot of unproductive staring at the screen, is where to start. And having something to generate an idea, something to build off of, is absolutely invaluable, because you get stuck thinking, I want to create this amazing experience and I want to produce something learners really going to engage with, but then you have to generate that idea, and I think that can be really overwhelming. And so you're drawing a blank, you need somewhere to start. And so I would say that templates have been really helpful for me as a beginner to learn kind of what the options are and go from there. So in regards to creating a cohesive feel, I have a few small recommendations about decisions that you can make early on that will save you time later. For the sake of transparency, I should admit that we do have a graphic designer, since we're a custom shop, who makes all these decisions and provides us with a look and feel for our course. But I definitely spend a good amount of time studying what it is that he's created. So that way I'm not making a decision that he's already made or creating something that deviates from the feel that he's set forth. So in terms of the decisions that you're going to want to make early on that are going to make it a lot easier to move forward, you're going to want to decide on your font. What font are you going to use throughout? Are you going to consistently bold your directions, or are they going to be italicized? How big are those titles going to be? So that way they're consistent across your slides. And what about the regular text? You don't want to have too much of a deviation, so you'll want to decide what size those titles will be in comparison to the text of the body of your slide. You're also going to want to decide on color scheme. So it seems in best practice you're choosing 4 to 6 colors as a foundation, and then you can use shades of those if necessary, but you keep coming back to these colors to kind of draw the course together, so that even though every slide isn't going to use the same colors, there's still that sense that there's continuity there, because we're seeing these same colors pop up again and again. Also, something I learned as a beginner that I never even considered was thinking about shapes. So deciding from the beginning whether you're going to have a boxier feel and your shapes are going to have sharp corners, or you're going to have lots of angled boxes or angles jutting across your screen, or even if you're going to have circles, whether the shapes are going to be circles, whether the images are going to be circles, and thinking about whether you have kind of that boxier feel or that rounder feel. I just found that has even saved me time, that I'm not worrying about whether or not I should round corners when I'm adding a shape of some kind behind a text box. And so that frees me up ultimately to worry about the experience, or to think about what it is that I'm creating, as opposed to spending time deciding on what that shape looks like, or how I'm presenting an image. So that's been very helpful. And then finally, I think we should talk about tools. So there are a ton of tools to make your life easier, but I'm just going to cover 3 that have saved me a lot of time. I primarily use Storyline 360 or PowerPoint when I storyboard, so I'll be focusing on some tools that they both share. So the first that I'm going to start with is alignment. When you select a shape or a series of shapes, you'll have a graphics toolbar appear at the top. And this handy little menu allows you to align without having to drag and wait for those guidelines to appear. Because for some reason, I find sometimes they do and sometimes they seem to lag. So this way I can just select my shapes and I can align them either in relation to each other. I can distribute them in relation to each other, or I can align them in relation to the slide itself. So I use this every time I am creating an icon. So if I have my icon and I'm putting it on a shape, I am always going to select both the shape and the icon, and I'm going to align center and align middle, so that I'm not trying to eyeball it, that it's there and I don't have to worry about it. And then I'm actually going to move on to use my next tool, which is grouping. I have spent entirely too much time moving things all over the place and trying to fix them because I accidentally moved part of it and not the whole thing. And so that is why I group things whenever I can. Anything that needs to stay together, I'm going to select that, and anything that's part of it that I want to be moved together as one. And you're going to go to the format toolbar. That'll give you the drop down menu where you can choose to group your items, and then you can move them together and not worry about having to realign them every time because I've just selected the icon and moved it off the shape, which I have done quite a bit. So grouping is fantastic. And then I will close with the format menu pane. And so this, specifically, there's so many things you can do, but I'm going to focus on the size and position. So this applies to shape and images, and it's my go-to for checking that my images are the correct distance from the title bar. It also helps me when I want to make a series of images the same size, and I don't want to mess around with dragging corners to resize or trying to eyeball it or looking for guidelines. I can do this per image, or I can work in batches and select all of them. If you're doing the same thing to various assets, you can select them all, and then you can resize them all at the same time, which again, when you're looking for time savers, that's incredibly helpful. I've also learned the hard way, resizing shapes and images to try to make sure that they were the same size or to make them fit in a particular place. There's no guessing here. I can just use this to designate the exact size that I'm looking for. So I think we're going for the main theme of we want to work smarter, not harder. And I'm hoping that some of these suggestions will help you do that. And so while I could go on for another hour about my favorite tools, I think I have to wrap up for today. So I want to thank you so much for joining me today, and just remind you about some of the great resources that we have at eLearning Brothers.
Excellent. Thank you, Monica. We do have a couple more questions that have come in.
Sure.
That kind of span your full presentation. We've got a few minutes, so we'll take a couple of these.
Okay.
When you are trying to pick an activity or behavior that will help you move toward building experiences, are there certain activities that work better than others? So like, do you find that drag and drops are just the best for everything? Or like, how do you associate the right activities with the right experiences, and how to build those experiences?
Sure. I think that's a great question, because that definitely is the struggle. I would say that ultimately your scenarios that have narration are going to build that in more of a realistic, contextual way, so that if you're trying to teach a behavior, you're trying to show how they might need to respond in that scenario, or what they should do if they're stuck with this problem, then those scenarios, those more immersive situations are going to be better if you have the time for them. But like I said, with the drag and drop, you can do small things to make that work to create an experience. If your learner needs to understand the difference between what they're responsible for and what a different department is responsible for, then having them sort in a way that they might actually, whether they're checking things on a list that they have on their, what looks like a phone, something that people might do on a regular basis, these things I'm responsible for. It's basically a sorting activity. You're just changing the way that it looks. And I think that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to make it meaningful to what the learner might experience.
Excellent. There's another question here that says, there's several questions about tips for using graphics if you're just pulling them from a library. One person says images and graphics take as much time as creating the content. What tips do you have for finding the right graphics, searching? Another person says, I've tried using templates, but I struggle with the cohesive feel part because I don't always use all of the slides. I don't want to take up too much of your time on this one, Monica, but if you guys would like to get some tips on using templates and assets, we have a site called support.elearningbrothers.com. There are tons of tips for using templates and assets, including graphics and things like that. We had a series of videos made, I think it was a year and a half ago now, about how to grab a template and then quickly, like within 10 minutes, make it exactly what you need, including matching brand, matching look and feel, matching everything. And that's all at support.elearningbrothers.com. But I would love to give you an opportunity, Monica, to talk about how you've overcome that as well. Images and graphics tend to take as much time as creating the content. What tips do you have for working quickly with graphics?
Sure, I completely understand that. When I started, was very much about finding the perfect image, and I would go through page and page and page looking for the perfect image. I would say specificity is your friend. I would start out really specific about what do you visualize in that image? Do you see people in that image? Do you see documents on a desk? Do you see a particular type of document on a desk? Do you see that person doing something specific? And I have learned that if I am very specific first, and if I don't find what I'm looking for on the first or maybe second page, then I will be a little bit more general. But that has been a lot more effective for me than putting in something very broad and just going through page after page, hoping that I'm going to see the person doing the specific thing that I'm hoping that they're doing. But I don't have an easy answer to the graphics because especially with the nature of the course, some images are just going to be a lot more challenging to find, and they are going to take a long time. I think if you find that you're really struggling with images, you put some time in, I always recommend reaching out to your SMEs and asking if there are specific images. That's one question that I ask usually in the kickoff call when I'm talking to my SME. Hey, for this particular, if we're representing this community, what kind of community is it? Are we looking at a condominium? Are we looking at a neighborhood? Where is this located? What do you imagine seeing? And a lot of times they'll have ideas, and so that helps me kind of narrow it down than just coming up with a general idea of what this might look like when they have it. Or sometimes they have images that have already been approved that they want to use. And so that saves time too.
Lots of time if it's already been approved, yeah.
Yeah.
So we've got a question or two more, but before we go to those, I do want to talk about what's here on the screen. So Monica mentioned that you can see some of what we've been building. You can see what our custom team has been building, and you can request a jam session or a demo to just sit and look over some of the things that our custom team has done. You can also look through our template libraries, and we've even got off-the-shelf courseware that'll knock your socks off. Like, it's a huge course library, and we're going to do a webinar about that next Thursday if you guys would like to join. But if you want to schedule one of these jam sessions, send an email to scondi at eLearning Brothers. It's there on the screen. I'll also send out in the email that has a recording of this session. I will make sure to put a link in there that you guys know where to reach out to get one of those. You can also register for a free trial if you go to elearningbrothers.com. There's a free trial section. You can grab 10 assets, any 10 assets from our asset library. That includes PowerPoint templates, Storyline, Captivate, Lectora, Camtasia. We've got tons of templates in there that you guys can grab and try 10 of those if you'd like to try and save some time. That's really what our goal is, to help you become an e-learning rock star by saving you tons of time and therefore tons of money and making you look like a rock star. Really, that's what it does. Okay, some of the new questions that have come in. You showed us, this session's called storyboarding. You talked a little bit about the storyboarding process, but what would you say is the difference between storyboarding and blueprinting? Or are they the same thing that just kind of accomplish different tasks?
That is a really great question. So storyboarding is going to be much more in-depth. It's going to show exactly what is going to be on your slide. And it's going to have, so when I storyboard, I have every visual element that's going to be on each slide. And sometimes, especially for interactions, when I have characters going back and forth, I have a different slide for each line of dialogue. So every time their pose changes and they say something different, then I'm going to have a different slide. So I might have 5 or 6 for a short conversation. So I'm going to show exactly what is happening on the screen, and then I'm going to have a lot of notes for my developers. I'm going to have my narration, exactly what my characters are going to say. I'm going to have what is happening, what kind of interaction is it? Is this an animated text slide? Is this a drag and drop activity? How does it work? So when I'm dragging the cards to the box And once they drop it, if it's correct, what happens? If it's incorrect, what happens? And a lot of the times that level of specificity is, and because we're a custom shop and so our clients expect that because they're weighing in on these details, it's really helpful for buy-in because I can say, this is the kind of feedback that your learner is going to get. And my client can say, that's great, that's what we want them to see, what we want them to hear, or actually, we don't want you to tell them what the correct answer is, we want them to go back and keep doing it until they get it right. So now we can start making those decisions about how they want this to function, and they can weigh in on the experience because I've shown them exactly what it's going to look like, exactly what's going to happen from one step to the next, and I've included all of those details about what's going to happen if the learner does this? What's going to happen if the learner they try to move forward? Are they allowed to move forward, or are there certain restrictions? So it's the blueprint is going to be more of this plan just for me, and I don't have to show that to anybody. My storyboard is going to be very detailed, every scene slide by slide, what it looks like and what's going to happen.
Excellent. Thank you, Monica. Those are all the questions that we're going to take today. Thanks everybody for participating. Like I said, reach out to skondi@elearningbrothers.com or just go to elearningbrothers.com and click on free trial. We'd be happy to show you everything that we've got and get you hooked up with some free assets. So we hope we'll see you guys next time. Thanks, Monica, again.
Thanks very much.